Welcome to VLGA Connect. My name is Catherine Arndt and I'm the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. I hope you enjoy today's Connect episode brought to you by the VLGA, the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's edition of the Governance Update. Thanks to our good friends at Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. And I'm not sure if you've noticed, but this week is Federal Budget Week and we thought it would be a good idea to get an overview of the federal budget. And to that end, we have with us Jo Noesgaard of SGS Consulting.
Thanks, Steve.
Hello, Jo.
Good to be here.
Good, I'm glad you're glad. Now, if we're going to talk about the budget and you're particularly going to talk about some issues affecting local government, I think it would be good to know what's your background that would enable you and I to have this conversation.
Yeah, so as of 3 months ago, I was working in local government. So I've been in the local government sector for about 12 years, starting off at Maribyrnong City Council in the social planning team, then moved over to Hobsons Bay, which is where we connected. And just
by way of disclosure, we are former colleagues.
So yeah, I worked in lots of different areas at Hobsons Bay, which is great. And then after about 6 years or so, I then went across to Casey City Council to really experience a growth area, which was amazing. So I spent about 3 years with the great team down there, and then thought it was time to check out the consultancy world. So I've worked with SGS on multiple different projects whilst I was in council, and really appreciated their ability to, one, understand local government, but also kind of keep pushing the policy agenda. So it's been great to be part of that team.
So that sort of, that will be really useful context because, as we said, we're not going to try to do line by line analysis of the budget because other people are doing that.
Yeah.
But you and I have talked about 4 or 5 really key areas that just merit a bit more of a deep dive. And I just wonder, Jo, if we can start, and it is a bit of a topic at the moment, especially given the condition of the roads after the floods, what's happening with infrastructure?
Yeah, so infrastructure, the kind of the headline for infrastructure is that there's $120 billion going into transport infrastructure over the next 10 years. So the other kind of headlines are that they're going to renew the role of Infrastructure Australia, and they're going to do some reprioritisation of infrastructure investment and timelines. The other key point in here is that they're going to expand the $250 million for Local Roads Community Infrastructure Fund. This is a really important fund for local governments. It's been around for about 4 years or so now. And one of the few funds where local governments don't have to add their own money to it. So it means that you can actually go to the capital program, what didn't make it into the capital program, and go, great, we're going to pick up these 10 projects and actually, work through it, which is great from a renewal perspective.
I was going to say there should be more government funding like that.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Sadly. So what would be, I guess, the key implications there for local government in terms of, I guess, the planning and thinking that goes into infrastructure, Jo?
Yeah, so most councils now in Victoria should have finished their asset management plans or be very close to finishing their asset management plans. So I think we're in a really good spot in Victoria to really understand what are the infrastructure needs over the next kind of 10 years to really think through that capital program. I think there's the renewal gap that we're seeing in councils, especially things like the rate cap is now coming into effect in terms of where the pressures are. So I think infrastructure funding like this is really important to kind of work through those asset management plans that councils have developed.
And isn't it fair to say too that the development of asset management plans in the way that it's happened in Victoria has led to a far more strategic approach than we might have seen 10 or 15 years ago in terms of links to council plan and objectives?
Yeah, definitely. I think that governance arrangement has really helped with that. I think the data sets are still getting stronger. I don't think we've made it in terms of we've done our first asset management plan and we're good to go. So I think there's still a lot of data gathering and cleansing, working through our asset systems to really understand what that asset management looks like. But we're definitely heading the right path, I think.
Good stuff. Now, if we keep moving in terms of the asset section of the balance sheet, affordable housing is a topic and certainly got some attention in the budget this week.
So in affordable housing, they've set up the National Housing Accord, which will focus on the supply of affordable housing, which is great. It involves all levels of local government, investors and the construction sector. So I think that's a really great move in terms of, I think we'd all agree that affordable housing is a big issue across Australia, including Victoria, but it requires a whole of government and sector approach. So I think that's a really, really good positive sign that they're heading in that direction. The other things that they've got in there, so they're going to target to build 100 homes in 5 years. 1 million homes in 5 years. So
that'd be better.
Yeah. So that includes $350 million additional funding for 10,000 affordable homes. The states and territories will also match that with additional 10,000 homes. And that's all on top of the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund, which will build 30,000 homes in 5 years. The thing with this one, in terms of, I think we'd all agree that additional funding and affordable housing from government is needed, and it's a really key area to deliver affordable housing. The bit that is always really interesting is how do we get that stock on the ground, and how do we actually deliver those 10,000 or 20,000 dwellings in 5 years?
Well, there's a couple of issues there which maybe we'll do sequentially. The first is, I suppose, how is the construction industry going at the moment, and what does that mean in terms of actually getting buildings built?
Yeah, I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the construction sector, there's been a lot of demand on the construction sector, and they've done relatively well to try and keep up with that demand. But we've seen, with COVID and the closing of borders, we've seen the increase in costing of materials, increase in costing of staffing and trying to get staff, which has been really tricky. So it has actually really probably delayed to some extent in terms of how you can get as many dwellings on the ground. So I think there's a bit of a look at how do we actually get stock on the ground rather than just thinking more broadly around that funding side of it. The other bit that they've looked at is planning. This often comes up in terms of how do we get more stock on the ground? Well, let's look at the planning system. So the things that they've looked at here is improving zoning and planning regulations, including working with local governments in that space. And land, so looking at releasing state and Commonwealth land. There's also a bit of a movement towards also local government land. It'd be interesting to see what that looks like in reality.
I've got to say, Jo, I feel a bit ill on this topic because for a few reasons. One, there's this sort of clamour that often occurs for, let's just remove red tape from planning and develop land that maybe shouldn't be developed.
Yeah, I think planning is definitely one lever that we've got to implement affordable housing. So I think it should be in the mix. But it's not a silver bullet in terms of, we'll just fix the planning space and it'll be fine. So I think there's a bit more work to go in terms of what does that look like. I think the other side is what has been missing in this conversation is the development sector in terms of what they can do within their own developments, which you can do through the planning scheme, which Victoria has obviously got the voluntary negotiation in there to develop affordable housing within development. So I think there's a bit of work to go in there in terms of what developers can possibly do within their space, as well as other things we can look in the planning scheme. But
yeah, if my memory serves me right, Jo, there's a number of councils that have, as part of the planning approval process for major developments, almost offered concessions from a planning perspective if affordable housing is part of the development mix. Have I made that up?
Well, I mean, at the moment, because it's voluntary, so it's all based on negotiations. So depending on what that negotiation is, it could mean that, they might get more height, they might get less open space. There's a whole bunch of things that kind of comes into that mix. I mean, ideally, the ideal is to have a really well-built, livable development. So that should have the adequate open space, car parking, and setbacks and height requirements for that site.
Yeah, and councils are significant landowners. What do you think that means in terms of councils going through processes to identify its own land holdings, if you like, that might be suitable for development? What's happening in that space?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of local governments that are already well and truly working in the affordable housing space and doing some amazing work. So they are probably likely already done that bit of a scan of what do they already own in that property mix and what potentially could be used for affordable housing. So I think the councils that are already in that space are probably well and truly in train. I think there's some other things that councils have also looked at in terms of airspace, so looking above car parks or above community centres and what could that look like as well. The other thing is probably that not all councils have a lot of land, so some of them they don't have land available or land that's appropriate for housing. So I don't think it's a quick win of, there's amazing land supply, let's just pop some housing on it. So
yeah. And let's be fair too, the quantum of houses that are planned under this budget allocation probably still goes nowhere near meeting Australia's needs.
Yeah, correct. Which is why there needs to be that holistic view of affordable housing more broadly, but then also, how do we get that stock on the ground? So obviously there's a state election coming up, so maybe there'll be some further announcements there. Victoria's already got the big housing build, which is 12,000 homes, I think, in 4 years. So we'll see, there might be some more movement in that space.
I'm hearing go back and look at your housing policies and strategies and be prepared to go and do some advocacy.
And if councils have land that they've been looking at, this might be a great opportunity for them as well to kind of dip into that, what that looks like for them.
Oh, good stuff. Now, two more topics we'll go through, Jo. The next one is around gender equality implications, because this government has made no secret of the fact that gender equality is a big ticket item on its agenda.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things in here. So one being there's $4.7 billion over 4 years for cheaper childcare for parents, so decreasing that cost on the hip pocket for homeowners or home households. And then the other one is paid parental leave, bumping that up to 26 weeks by 2026.
Right. So that affects councils in a number of ways, as an employer, as an agency of government that oversights the livability of communities, the group of people that are available as employees, what that means in terms of community needs for presumably kindergartens and childcare.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think, with this, you'd expect that potentially more parents will be able to access childcare. So obviously with long day care, that includes childcare and kinder. So it'll be interesting to see if that has any impacts on kinders within the council realm, but also obviously that staffing impact as well.
And it's really an interesting space, and we won't go too far into it, Jo, but I'm sort of, isn't it one of those sectors where, the thinking of government is that, well, the market's going to provide those spaces, but often councils need to step in. There are competition policy implications and a need to have, a good policy reason for councils to be operating in that space. Yeah,
I think Victoria's seeing that mainly through the state in terms of the increase in kinder hours, so going from 15 to 30 hours for 4-year-olds and up to 15 hours for 3-year-olds, and just the infrastructure impacts that has, and councils delivering a lot of that infrastructure, and the lack of supply of infrastructure on the ground. So it's a really interesting time in terms of that kinder space. And hopefully we'll see something in the state election in terms of what that might mean for local governments.
Fingers crossed. Just one other thing in passing, that councils do have responsibilities under the Gender Equality Act and also municipal public health and wellbeing planning around family violence. Anything in there? There's
a little bit of funding for family violence, which is largely to be expected. So potentially opportunities there as well. So if councils have, although they've all got now gender equality strategies, in terms of what they're doing in their local communities, but also those community services as well in terms of providing services within the municipalities.
Oh, terrific. Now, just one last thing to finish off on, Jo, and I don't know if people have noticed it's been raining. And our thoughts and sentiments go out to particularly our friends and colleagues in the northern part of the state. We're sort of watching this slow-moving tragedy unfold, so I certainly don't want to make light of what's a really serious issue for those communities. But in terms of the budget, some funding allocated for emergency management.
Yeah, so they've allocated $200 million per year on disaster prevention and resilience initiatives. So that's through the Disaster Ready Fund, which was actually announced in September, so a bit earlier this year. Plus some additional funding for flood-affected communities as well. So that fund, in terms of some examples of infrastructure that they said that fund would do, was things around flood levies, cyclone shelters, fire breaks, and evacuation centres. That goes a long way in terms of thinking through what that might look like. I suppose we were having a bit of conversation before in terms of, well, what's the other prevention matters that potentially haven't been talked about in this. But
yeah, so a few things fall out of that, Jo, that it's a bit of a shift from the approach of the previous government, because we're now talking about disaster prevention and resilience, almost the pre-thinking. I was just looking at this, it's almost a thought bubble, that working backwards from your list, so evacuation centres, you would think at least the emergency management plans that are in place go a long way to identifying the requirements of evacuation centres. Similarly with fire breaks, it's generally pretty clear when they're needed. Cyclone shelters and then flood levies presumably require a bit more planning and forethought and potentially involving other agencies.
Yeah, I mean, especially flood mapping. I think, there's been a bit of conversation the last couple of weeks around, local government need to do more flood mapping, which I think we'd all agree in terms of the level of flood mapping. Some councils are well and truly ahead of it, whereas others are really yet to get into that space. But I mean, the key thing is that local governments can't do this alone. There's often that need to have other authorities in it, whether it be South East Water or Melbourne Water or whoever it might be, to come to the table as well to look at what that mapping might look like for the municipality and the region. And they're already understaffed as well. So it's really a systems thinking approach in terms of how do we deal with this. It's not just local government on their own in terms of how we kind of build a better kind of flood management arrangement.
Well, and there's almost winners and losers presumably, because as you know, there's serious legal consequences when water is diverted and creates a loss for someone downstream. So that's a real issue. I'm hearing you and also talk about sort of the cost of infrastructure and the interagency kind of cooperation.
Yeah, I think councils, well, those that are in it at the moment, plus those that have recently come out of it. The cost of infrastructure, just one, to repair that infrastructure, but then generally it's going to be a redevelopment. It might not be like for like in terms of what they're replacing, whether that be pipes and pits in terms of how big they are, road surfaces, those type of things. So there is an infrastructure cost in terms of that redevelopment as well.
Well, I think one of the things we've noticed too is that, and especially in an environment where we go from La Nina, very wet years, to a sequence of very dry years, and then the levees, for example, aren't required until they're required, and they presumably need to be maintained in the meantime. Yeah,
it's a big it's a broader issue, I think, than just a one-stop.
So I'm hearing a kind of an overall theme, Jo, around just the need to look beyond the headline to a real system thinking approach with all of these line items.
Yeah, I think so. And local governments do this really well in terms of connecting up with each other, connecting up with their other industries within their local governments as well, working with the state government, and then obviously working with the federal government.
I think that's a really good place to end on, Jo. We've had the very good fortune of talking today with Jo Noesgaard from SGS. Thanks again, Jo. Chris Eddy, you'll be pleased or otherwise to know, we'll be back next week, it's expected. So we'll have another governance update then. We'll see you. And thanks again to Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, Steve.
Nice.
Yeah.